great that you guys could join. This is the first weekly meeting, hopefully of many more weeks of Elsa Workflows. And as I just said, I think it might be a nice way for the community to see what the status is, what we're thinking about. Also a nice opportunity to give some demos that I can do or anyone else from the community really. Any topics that people might want to raise, we can discuss those things. Speaking of topics, I have a bunch of them. First of all, this weekly meeting, this is the first meeting ever. We're recording this. Hopefully it will contain some useful content for folks to watch later, especially maybe when it comes to decisions we make or topics we're thinking about, design decisions, but also demos, as I mentioned. Of course, the steering committee elections I announced yesterday. And what's the point of a steering committee? As many of you know, I've been doing this project largely by myself, and I enjoy doing that, and I will keep doing that. But the community is growing pretty big. Elsa is becoming an important component for many applications already. So I figured it would be good to have an official committee that can manage the project and the community, and also as a way to bounce off ideas and govern the project. Instead of it being just me, it would be good to have, for example, could be anything really, anything related to the Elsa project. And of course, it's all voluntarily, so it's not like those people are obligated to do anything. I think it's a nice title. It also gives you a voice in the potential directions of the project. So it could be interesting for people who use Elsa actively and have a stake in the project, if you will, to give them a vote. And obviously, we always listen to what the community's sentiment is. So if we see that certain features are missing or there's a big demand for documentation, which I know there is, we respond to those things. Some of these topics are more easily discussed amongst a committee. The steering committee is one form of trying to govern this project. I've been reading and listening a lot about DAOs, so that's decentralized autonomous organizations, as another vehicle to govern something. This might be interesting to explore later. There's a lot of investigation to do before we try such a thing, but I think it's an interesting notion as well. All right, so let's first go over the current status. As some of you know, 2.6 was released yesterday or the day before yesterday, 2 days ago. And so a bunch of things are new, some small features like this JavaScript function. But the biggest change for this one has to do with stability, especially regarding the Azure Service Bus activities. I know of a customer, they are using this heavily and they were seeing a lot of issues with 2.5, thanks to, I believe it was Jay, forgive me if I'm wrong, Jeremy. That was crucial, the findings you did, so that I'm very grateful for that. After that was fixed, the issues disappeared immediately. So that was a big issue for this customer. And speaking of which, of course, this is also a call to folks who are interested in becoming a steering committee member to announce yourself as a candidate for the election that would then start 2 weeks from now, give or take. So that would be really nice. And we still have to discuss the election process itself, what it would look like. For example, would people get 5 votes to distribute amongst the candidates? And to be clear, I'm thinking of having a maximum of 5 members in the committee, and then each voter could spend one of their 5 votes on one candidate, or one of each, or should everyone get 1 vote? That's something we can discuss in a week or 2. But it will be good to give it some thought. So back to the 2.6 release. So as I said, that's the major improvement. Everything else is just whatever got in with the 2.6 release, and I think we should try to release regularly, and then just see whatever gets in, and then if something doesn't make a release, probably going to make it the next release and then try to maybe release, I don't know, every month or maybe every 2 months. We have to see what makes sense and what's realistic. But having a predictable release cadence might be good for us in the community to rely on increasingly so. This was another important fix for some scenarios. If you use nested forks and joints, that didn't work, but now it does. So that was a good fix. So yeah, I was pointing here and here, everywhere. So this issue, by the way, of course, this is a release notes. I have issues pinned at the top here about the weekly community meeting that we're having right now, this one, and the steering committee elections, that's this one. So if you want to read about the rules, proposed rules, I just made these up as I went. If you have any suggestions, feedback, or other thoughts, please share them here, and then we can take them into account. All right, so now with 2.6 out of the way, 2.7, I would like to release, I think I set a milestone here, April 30. So trying to release every month. We'll see if that's practical or not, but it's what I'm gonna try. Right now it contains a bunch of stuff that some of it has been moved from 2.6 to this milestone, others were added to this directly. We might use this meeting as a grooming session. So we go over these issues and then prioritize them, move them out to a different milestone or back to the backlog if we think it's not important enough compared to other items. We will see. We could also have a separate triage meeting because generally it can become a little bit boring to watch at issue, look at issues and then discuss them. Unless you're a stakeholder of that issue, then it's interesting. So yeah, for 2.7, I do know that there's a bunch of PRs, and one is a very big one. It has to do with multi-tenancy, and this PR created by Constantine, he did a lot of work to enable multi-tenant configurations. So here you would have not multi-tenancy at the service collection level, I think, but at the very least, every tenant will have its own configuration. So that means you could have a single deployment, but pointing to different databases or the same database, actually different databases. This does not support the same database, but with differentiating table prefixes, for example, like Orchard Core does. That's not here, but it serves their purpose. I am considering merging this in, but I want to find a way to try it first, not just me, but also maybe others. So maybe what I'm going to do is I am going to merge it into master so that it gets deployed to MyGet. Multi-tenancy, by the way, is optional. It's not going to be enabled by default. So in theory, nobody should be bothered by it. But if you want to try it out, that would be good and try and gather some feedback. One thing that I was hoping for the multi-tenancy story of Elsa 2 is to have a service collection per tenant so that every tenant can actually have its own set of services. Also, what Orchard Core has today, but that's not part of this PR. But we can add it later if we want it. So probably that could go into 2.7 alongside many fixes and issues that we have already. For 3.0, I'm gonna show the current status of that, and I'm gonna show two things: the designer in its current state, and the programmatic API, which is a big departure from Elsa 2. As you know, in Elsa 2 we're using a fluent interface. Let's see if I can find an example. Yeah, for example here. So here we have a user registration workflow, a very simple one, and it uses extension methods to create and then link activities to each other. So this is in Elsa 2, the type of workflow is always that of a flowchart, and the way flowchart works, you have nodes in the diagram, and they're connected through connections. And this is what the Fluent API allows you to do. And for Elsa 3, things are a little bit different. So the way it works in Elsa 3 is there's no Fluent API. Instead, you are directly instantiating the activities as if they were little Lego blocks to build a house. That's what you do in Elsa 3 when using the programmatic, API, if you will. And I'll find an example for that. So here we have an example. This is Elsa 3 syntax. You still have a workflow builder. So you implement the workflow using this interface. You get a build method that you implement to actually build out your graph. And then a big difference here is that your workflow can only have one activity. It's called the root. So it's the root of your diagram basically. And if you wanted to have multiple activities, you can use in this example, a sequence. And a sequence is just a sequence of steps. So it's like a list of activities and they execute one after the other. So in this example, we are setting the activities list of the sequence to an instance of an HTTP endpoint, then an if construct or an if activity, and then a write HTTP response. So it goes from this one to this one to this one. So there's, as you can see, there's no connections, it's just a sequence. That's just one style of a diagram. There's of course also a different one called the flowchart diagram. And the flowchart diagram itself has a list of children and it has connections between those children. Clearly inspired on the Windows Workflow Foundation API. It's what I tried to do for Elsa 2 when I started it, but I couldn't find a good way between the ability to just connect nodes using the connection object, what we have for the flowchart. So here it has a list of connections, and combine it with things like what we have here with if. So here, if it has a then property and an else property, and the type of these properties are activity. So that's just a different way of connecting to nodes, right? So, but for Elsa 3, I think I found a nice solution to that, where you are explicit about the type of diagram. So here, this is a sequence. It doesn't have a notion of connections, but a flowchart, of course, totally can have a concept of connections. And yeah, and of course the challenge is, how do you deal with that in the designer? Speaking of which, let me load the designer. So while that loads, I actually want to show another change in Elsa 3, which has to do with the way you deal with variables, for example. So here again, we have a simple workflow. Here I'm defining a workflow variable. So it's just a local variable to this method. I assign it to the variables collection so that it's in the scope of this sequence. And this is important. Variables in Elsa 3 have their own scope, and different container activities have their own scope of variables. And what's nice about having this as a C# variable in this way is that you can reference it directly. So here I'm running a bit of a JavaScript activity that evaluates 1 + 1, and it stores the output in this variable. So the output, in fact, this is an activity that, this is a wrong example. It's supposed to be like this, so it should have object. And if you inherit from an activity that has a return type, it automatically inherits a result property. So you don't have to do it explicitly, but you could if you want to, because at the end of the day, it's just an output property that you have to set from your execute activity or method. And of course, we can maybe improve on it, where you can just return the value that you want to return as an output to make the syntax more C# like, if you will, but we will see. In any case, this run JavaScript activity has an output, a result, and that result is then assigned to this variable, and now this variable carries a reference to this result, and then you can use it, for example, here. So here I'm writing out whatever the output was of the run JavaScript activity by saying variable.get, and then it requires the context. It's like the activity execution context from Elsa 2, but here it's called the expression execution context. So it's a bit of an abstraction so that it can also be used outside of the context of workflow execution, which is important for determining the bookmarks or the triggers of a workflow. So some aspects are similar, some others are very different, but I will try and document these things, of course, before this is actually released. At this point, there's a lot of changes going on still. So imagine you have a workflow where you have a loop, and this variable should only exist within that loop. So if, for example, if you have a while activity, maybe I have one here. I don't have one here, but I can just create one. Let's say I have a while, and then I have some condition. So let's make this an infinite loop, and it has an iterate or a body that executes during each iteration. And this could be, say, a sequence, and the sequence can have variables, and then this variable could be, well, let's declare it here. So to be clear, this is a C# variable, this temp thing, but it's of type variable, and that's a workflow variable, and it's declared here. The reason I'm assigning it to a local variable is so that I can reference it from code, but when the workflow executes, it only exists in this sequence. Now, while every time this iterates, this variable will be reinitialized, so it will lose its value, and this is important for scenarios where you want to actually lose this information because maybe you're maintaining an index of something, and then that should only keep incrementing within the loop. But if at some point the while loop exits and it continues on to the next activity, and then some activity somehow loops back to this while, you don't want the variable to begin with, for example, the value of 10 if you had 10 iterations and then you had logic depending on that. So it's a little bit similar to why you don't want global variables in a C# program or in any application. You want scoping to not accidentally overwrite values from different scopes, but also for them to be reinitialized when a function executes again. Correct, and that's because of I'm declaring the variable here, but this is the C# world, if you will, but the workflow world starts here. So within this sequence. So when this sequence is executed the first time, this will be initialized. So it will see, okay, I have a variable of this variable. The storage for this variable, it's not visible from here, but it exists in the activity execution context that get created as activities start to execute. It's two separate worlds, so to speak, the C# world and the workflow world. From the C# point of view, you are building your diagram, but once it executes, you need to try and shift focus from this temp variable to exist only within this scope, within the sequence scope. And then of course here, I know this one here, but let's now create a set of steps. Here I say, for example, right line, and then I want to maybe print the current value. So as you can see, the value can only be accessed, the variable can only be accessed by having context, and this is important because this context is what actually stores the variable's contents or the value within a thing called a register. So it's like computer memory. There's a concept of an hierarchical set of registers to implement this scoping of data. Yeah, and of course, being able to code it like this, it's also what you could do is create composite activities easily, but also create functions that build up parts of your workflow in case you have a more complicated workflow. It's easier to do than compared to Elsa 2, especially because there, in order to make the syntax look nice, you need to write a lot of extension methods, which require a lot of maintenance. But more importantly, the flow and the hierarchy, it's more natural in Elsa 3. And what I mean by that is, for example, in Elsa 2, we have a notion of composite activities, but to implement that, lots of tricks had to be pulled out of my sleeve to make that work. But then there's also some caveats there that make it a little bit unnatural. In Elsa 3, there's none of that. It's just natively you can create a new composite activity, and a composite is like a workflow. It just has a root activity that can be anything. So in this example, it could be a sequence, it could be a flowchart, it could be just a write line activity, doesn't matter. And it will be even more useful when you use the designer, and the designer allowing you to create a composite activity using the designer. So that could be, let's say, a sequence that has a series of steps that you want to use. So now you have a composite activity that you can reuse in other workflows, increasing your productivity, hopefully. For example, let's say in this while loop, let's say I have here a sequence with activities, and now here I want to say, let's run a little flowchart. And then you need to define the activities. So this is a simple array of activities that would exist within your flow, and you need to define the connections. Now for this, it is straightforward to set up, but could be enhanced using a Fluent API maybe to build and link activities similar to the way it's done in Elsa 2. That could be added later if we think it's useful. Yeah, so this is like that. Of course, you can define a activity so that you can just use this composite. So here what I'm doing, I'm creating a new flowchart. I could also say do a new composite that has a root, which then has this flowchart. Yeah, you may wonder what's the point of that. More useful might be to have a custom activity that is a composite from and then you use its constructor to define its route. And then you can reuse it easily in your workflows. So let me see if I can undo my errors and start this project here. Could be that it's very slow because of the screen recording and the sharing. I don't know. Oh, might be trying to connect to a non-running SQL server. I know what this is. It's well, this is a bug. I'm just discovering now, but I also know what caused it. All right, so this is an initial look for the Elsa 3 designer. It's very basic, bare bones for now. My main focus is to make it functional, and then later maybe look at the aesthetics. What I am trying for this iteration is for the designer to be embeddable and also have the basic necessities that you would need. For example, have a workflow definition browser. Instead of having it as a separate view, I want it to be part of this one component to keep things simple, and it would allow other developers, of course, to have, there's always the option of creating your own dashboard. But what I'm planning on doing is to start a new project, a dashboard project that may or may not embed this designer. If it initially it will. Ultimately, I might migrate this to using Blazor as the technology to implement this designer, but also to have a modular application framework for the dashboard, so that you can do things like creating custom modules that are specific to your own application and install existing modules from the gallery from NuGet that add features like forms or other functionality. But these are still just thoughts, nothing really concrete yet. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, please do share. But this is the current status. You can pick and choose your workflow. There's pan and zoom. So let me add some activity so you can see it in action. Zoom, let me move it here. And zoom out, zoom in. There's a properties pane on the right hand side, so allowing you to quickly make changes to these activities properties. There's no common properties yet. You can publish if it works. Nope, I broke it. But you get the idea. This is the current state, and of course you need to be able to select them. And we want to make this being able to connect these activities and add activities more productive. So instead of having it to do in a two-step fashion like this, what I want to be able to do is basically draw a line and then release, and then have an inline activity picker, very similar to Node-RED, if not the same. If you're familiar with Node-RED, they have that, and in fact this look and feel is inspired on that. But lots of work to do still. I'm currently working on an initial implementation of Elsa 3 using the code-only API for a customer to test the core engine. Right now I know of a few bugs that make it not work, but I'm working on fixing that. Hopefully around May there will be an initial release of or preview release of Elsa 3, just to give it a spin. The Fluent API build workflows, that syntax is not automatically going to work for the new syntax. I haven't given it that much thought to see if that could be ported as is. And I don't want to say it's not possible, because maybe it is, but I'm not sure what the amount of effort would be involved in allowing for that, and if it's even possible. Well, it will be interesting to try out to see what it would take to take it as is and fit it into the Elsa 3 engine. Because the Elsa 3 engine is very versatile, it can support any kind of workflow or activity type. I am considering an experiment to try and basically take an Elsa 2 workflow that you would have designed through the designer and execute it through the version 3 engine. But this also depends on bandwidth and other priorities. Backwards compatibility isn't important. Yeah, we have to see what the bandwidth looks like. So when you talk about workflow definitions designed by the designer, we can totally imagine having a converter. So what I was just referring to was running it as is. Might be an interesting experiment and maybe even useful, but I can imagine that it might be more useful to convert it. So you take the source workflow definition, transform them into an Elsa 3 format, because then of course it's easy to also make changes to those workflows. If we wouldn't do that, that means that the designer too should have some sort of compatibility with the Elsa 2 format, and that might be a lot of work. And I think at this point we're a little bit too small to allow for that, unless there wasn't anything else to do, right? But there's a lot of other missing features to do as well. All right, we got a little over 50 minutes left. I wanted to show two new features of 2.6, or actually retention policy isn't new, but I figured might as well take this opportunity to show what that looks like. in Elsa 2 because it's not documented yet. So let me talk a little bit about what is retention, the retention policy in this context. It's just about being able to delete your workflow instances automatically, but of course not just any workflow instance. You should be able to control the aids of the workflow instances and under what conditions they should be eligible to be deleted. Active workflow instances you probably don't want to delete, but maybe workflow instances that have completed 60 days ago, maybe you want to clean them up, because if you don't, your database file will grow, it includes the workflow execution log and workflow instances that have executed for a long time. They will have generated a lot of execution log records, so you may want to be cleaning that up, and using a retention policy you can do so automatically. And with 2.6 there's now the option to have full control over the conditions under which you would like these instances to be deleted. Let me see if I can find the example. So here you can see it. There's the add retention services function that's added by the retention module, which is a separate package. If you reference it, you will have this method available to you on the Elsa options object. And then what you can do, you can configure its options, which is of type cleanup options. And here you can specify things like a sweep interval. So that's the amount of time to wait before loading workflow instances from the database to be deleted. You can specify a batch size so that it's not gonna load in thousands of workflow instances, but just 100 at a time by default. And the time to live. So that's the maximum age of a workflow instance that it's allowed to exist before being removed. And then there's a pipeline basically, which allows your application to control if a workflow instance is actually eligible to be deleted or not. Here I have an example. Here I add a filter to this pipeline. So I'm specifying my own pipeline here. And here I'm saying add this workflow status filter, which is implemented as follows. Basically, it implements the getShouldDelete method, and it needs to return true or false. If you return true, the workflow instance will be deleted, otherwise it won't. And the pipeline stops as soon as it receives a true, or false actually. I might be confusing myself, let me see. I should add a XML comment here. So this is the abstract class, it's invoked here. Yeah, so as soon as it returns true, as soon as the workflow instance needs to be deleted, the pipeline stops. If you return false, it goes on to the next filter, and ultimately if nobody returned true, then the workflow instance will not be deleted. And to be clear, it only passes through the pipeline workflow instances that match these basic criteria that I talked about here. So it needs to have exceeded its time to live. Well, actually that's it. So this is the basic control. We could enhance it further if we think that's necessary, but that's what it is right now. So you mean within the 4 hours, because every 4 hours it will continuously load the next 100. And you're saying, well, if you're generating more than 100, let's say every minute, and then let's take an extreme number, then this might not be able to keep up. If that's the case, then you can of course increase the batch size and decrease the sweep interval. But when the sweep is taking place, it will continuously be loading workflow instances. So it's not going to take 100 every 4 hours. What it's going to do is every 4 hours, it's going to keep deleting, but in batches of 100. So process 100 and then it goes on to the next batch. After this is all done, then 4 hours later, it will begin again. That's a great idea. And we can make that extensible or pluggable. So right now the behavior is a hard delete, but maybe that can be replaced with a service or some provider or a strategy that you control as an application. And then you can totally choose to, instead of deleting it, migrating it to another database, or both. First copy it over and then delete, whatever makes sense for your scenario. But that's a good idea. We can do that. Yeah, so here currently it's hard-coded using a cleanup job that's resolved here. Of course, this cleanup job, it has this logic, but we can have it inject a strategy that by default performs the hard, but can be easily replaced. I like that. So the next thing is redacting sensitive information. Very important. Right now, imagine if you have an HTTP endpoint on your workflow and it receives user logins, for example, using a username and password. This information will be stored in your workflow instance and the workflow execution log. And through the designer, people will be able to see this information, and that's not desirable. So if you have that situation, then what you want to do is redact that data as it as it gets displayed or as it enters the system. Currently, you can't redact as it enters the system. It's just not implemented, but we could. But what's more important is that it's not visible to users of the designer and looking at the workflow execution log. So what you can do is filter that out as follows. So here there's a sample application called mask PII, and the scenario here is that we have a user registration workflow where the user signs up, they post their username and their password, for example, and we want to filter it out as the workflow execution log gets displayed in the front end. So to do so, you need to implement a filter. Let me see. Okay, so there's two types of filters. So this is the activity state filter that is displayed in the front end. Actually, I should show you. All right, so let's say we have a workflow called signup, exposing an endpoint to store a user. Let's actually give that a try. So I'm gonna run this HTTP request, and that's done. So if we now look at the workflow instance, this one, we can look at this activity state, trying to remember if it was actually storing this data in the activity state or not. I don't think that's the case here, but in the journal, you would of course see the inbound HTTP request. You saw it in the activity state? Yeah, so in the journal, it's redacted. Yeah, exactly. You may have expected this complicated password, but it's redacted. To implement this, you need to, that's this one. And I got confused with this HTTP endpoint workflow journal filter, because what you have to implement is the iWorkflow journal filter itself. You can do it directly, but for HTTP endpoints, I imagine there's probably some fields that you always want to be able to process easily when protecting or when redacting HTTP requests, such as the body, the raw body, and the headers. So this is more of a convenience-based class. If you have a scenario where you want to redact inbound HTTP requests using HTTP endpoint, then this is a convenient base class. And what it allows your application to do is just say, I want to process the body. And then what do? You just say, okay, I know I'm receiving a password field in the body, and I'll just replace that value with, well, in this case, some asterisks. The same goes for the raw body field of the HTTP endpoint. Of course, this requires some intimate knowledge of the HTTP endpoint, the way its outputs and what it's storing actually in the journal. To see that, let's take a look at the HTTP endpoint. So here we know it's storing the inbound request, so it's storing its HTTP request model. And of course, we know that it has the headers, it has a body and a raw body. And so this is what we want to process when redacting. And then there's an activity state filter, which does a similar thing, but for the activity state. So if we now click the store user, we select this one and we look at its state, it stored its user as a property. And as you can see, we redacted this as well. So it's two kinds of filter, one for the journal, one for the activity state. So that's what the redacting feature allows you to do. And I think this was part of 2.5, although I'm not sure, maybe it's new with 2.6. That's it for my demos. I think we are on time, but if there's any other topics or questions, we can maybe take them next time, or if it's something small, I'm happy to do it now. And if nothing else, then thank you for attending. Then I suggest we'll be here next week again. At least I will be. All right. Thanks, guys.